Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the gentlelady from North Carolina for yielding me the customary time, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this Congress is an absolute mess. The gentlelady from North Carolina says that our rhetoric doesn't carry a bit of substance, but let me begin by asking a question of the American people, a very simple question. Are you better off today than you were a year and a half ago? It has been 18 months since Donald Trump returned to the White House. Republicans have controlled every lever of power in Washington for over a year and a half. They control the House, they control the Senate, they control the White House, they even control the Supreme Court. And that is the one simple question to me that matters more than anything else that we will debate today. In fact, it is the only thing that matters, really. Is it easier to fill up your gas tank? Are your rent bills more affordable? Are your groceries cheaper? Have your prescription medicine costs gone down? Does your paycheck go further? In short, Mr. Speaker, life has gotten easier. Has life gotten easier for anybody over these last 18 months, or has it gotten harder? I think most people, including most Republicans, if they're being honest with themselves, they know the answer. They don't need a politician or a fancy economics degree to say that things are not better. They are not better. In fact, they will tell you that things are worse, much, much, much worse. They see it every time they tap their credit card at the gas station. They see it every time they check out at a grocery store. They see it every month when their rent is due, when their electric bill comes in, when the pharmacist says their kid's medicine is more expensive. They see it when their paycheck just doesn't go as far as it used to. This is the Republican economy. These are their prices, and it is their policies that have failed America miserably. Donald Trump and Republicans promised they would use their power to lower costs on day one. Well, it is year two, and costs are not lower, which by any definition would make that a broken promise. So why are prices up? Why is life harder? Why are things worse off now? The reason is simple. It's because instead of working with Democrats to fight for everyday people, Republicans have made one decision after another to help the rich and the powerful and basically hurt everybody else. I have example after example. Are things better off because of Trump's tariffs, Mr. Speaker? The tariffs that the New York Federal Reserve says are almost exclusively paid by American consumers, American farmers, American manufacturers, and American companies. Does that make anybody better off? I don't think most people would say that tariffs have made their lives better. I think they would say that the tariffs have made their life worse, more expensive, more difficult. Or what about the war in Iran? A new, endless, illegal war. Another one of Donald Trump's broken promises. Does anyone think that's made life better for the American people? Maybe it's made life better for defense contractors. Maybe for the crazy neocon warmongers, they get a kick out of another war. But not for everyday people. Not for everyday people. We have spent probably well over $100 billion on this illegal and reckless war. $100 billion. That's not on helping make sure that Americans don't go hungry. That's not on lowering health care costs or lowering people's rents or lowering gas prices. It's on this crazy war, a war of choice that the president had no plan for. Doesn't know what the hell he's going to do next. This is nuts. In fact, we're now 5 months into a war that these guys said would only last a couple of weeks. They've declared victory like 6 times, yet the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. More American troops, sadly, were killed this weekend. Gas prices are back above $4 a gallon. Inflation continues to skyrocket. Does anybody think that's made life better for most Americans? 5 months of war in the Middle East. I could go right down the line. Republicans promised better health care. Instead, they passed a law that takes hundreds of billions of dollars out of Medicaid and leaves millions more people uninsured. How the hell does that make anybody's life better? Republicans promised lower taxes. except they chose another tax giveaway for those at the very top, and they pat themselves on the back for the pennies they gave to everyone else. Has that made life better for people? And after 18 months of higher costs, more inflation, new wars, costly tariffs, and stunning corruption, now they're bringing us a continuing resolution that kicks the can down the road. They're bringing us a pathetic excuse of a stock trading ban that fails to address the much larger culture of corruption and self-dealing coming out of the White House. And they're bringing us a budget framework authorizing $73 billion for Trump's illegal Iran war, $12 billion as a Band-Aid to help farmers that their policies continue to hurt, and another $10 billion to rig the November elections. That's nearly $100 billion in new spending with no offsets, meaning this bill could very well increase the debt by over $100 billion. Whatever happened to the old-fashioned Republicans who wanted to pay for things, who didn't want to increase the deficit or the debt? I guess that's a thing of the past. Not one thing in this reconciliation bill, by the way, not a single damn thing will be about affordability. Not one thing will lower prices. That's called being out of touch, Mr. Speaker. And there will be time to debate their crummy bills on the floor this week, but this hour is about priorities. And Republicans have their priorities all out of whack. Their agenda has only made things better for those at the top, for the Mar-a-Lago members and CEOs with private jets, the donor class and the corporate special interests. Things are better for them. But for the rest of America, their agenda has been a disaster. The policies of this Republican Congress are a dumpster fire for everyday people, a total disaster. Their tariffs are crushing people. Their war is driving up costs. Their toxic environmental policies are filling our air with smoke and our food with parasites. And Americans are dying in the Middle East for their war. Again, Mr. Speaker, when I go back home and I ask people, are you better off than you were 18 months ago? They don't even answer. They laugh because it's such a ridiculous question, because it is so obvious that all of us are worse off because of this Republican majority and because of this administration, which cares only about not hurting the president's fragile feelings and delicate ego. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll just note our priorities are not out of whack. The number one role of the federal government is the defense of this nation. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Representative Fuller.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the rule. This important legislation is required to allow Republicans in this House to advance important priorities for the American people, including funding legislation to keep our government operating. Unfortunately, it's become clear as the House has considered appropriations legislation on the floor and in Chairman Cole's committee that Democrats are trying to hold our government hostage. This legislation will make clear where Democrats stand. Will they vote against keeping the government working for the American people, or will they vote to keep us hostage? Will they vote with me to fund important priorities, such as the programs that will allow communities in my district and many others to clean up and recover from years of PFAS contamination? Or will they vote to hold hostage programs that will make Appalachian communities like mine healthier, all to score political points? I know where I stand. I know where leadership in this body stands. I promised my constituents I would be a warrior for North Georgia, and I'm proud to do that today. I urge my colleagues to support this rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a little confused. The gentleman who just spoke, maybe he doesn't know this, but the government funding deadline isn't for months away. And he's like scolding us that it's like now. I'm going to tell you what the crisis is right now, is that people can't afford to live. And the gentlelady from North Carolina said our priority is about national security and national defense. I got news for her. National security means more than the number of bombs we have. It also means health care for people. It means whether people can afford food, whether they can afford rent, whether they can afford to put gas in the tank of their car, or pay their everyday bills, whether they have a good job that allows them to support their family. Those are all sources of our national defense and our national security. And I'll just say one other thing. I don't know how the hell our national defense and national security are served when the president takes us into an illegal, risky war in the Middle East, a war of choice that he has no plan for. Our troops are being put into harm's way, and this president has no plan about how to conduct this war or what the heck he's doing there. That's not national security. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to urge that we defeat the previous question, and if we do that, I will offer an amendment to the rule to make and order an amendment to H.R. 7008, consisting of the text of H.R. 6731, the Restore Trust in Government Act. This bill is the Democratic proposal for a more comprehensive and robust stock trading ban than is found in the Republican plan. And it is one which also includes the President of the United States and the Vice President. It is a level of corruption that we have never, ever seen in the White House. And what is the response from our Republican colleagues? Silence. Silence. They are scared of the guy in the White House. They won't challenge this corruption, so he makes billions and billions of dollars while hardworking Americans struggle. Mr. Speaker, in the first year of his term, President Trump cashed in to the tune of more than $2 billion, billion with a B. In 2025 alone, the president completed over 21,000 stock trades. His investment account grew by over $850 million. He tweets out glowing endorsements of companies after he buys their stocks. Now he's considering having people pay to get early access to his social media posts so they can cash in too. We need to ensure that the people can trust their government to work for them and not enrich himself. This means banning stock ownership by members and by this president. That is what the Democratic proposal will do. Let the House decide and make this amendment in order. That's all we're asking, is to allow us to have this debate. You can vote however you want. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment into the record along with any extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And to discuss our proposal, I yield 3.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me be clear about what my Republican colleagues are trying to do in their bill that they are advancing. They are trying to advance a fake stock trading ban. And I want to be very clear. Their bill does not block insider trading, no matter what it's called. It does not ban stock trading. The number one issue for over 80% of Americans who want members of Congress to stop padding their own pockets instead of addressing their constituents' interests. Things like ending the illegal war in Iran, bringing down gas prices, bringing down grocery prices, investing in housing. None of that is going to be protected. Their bill allows members to still purchase private stocks, keep public stocks that they already own, and act on legislative matters that directly increase the value of their stocks. It allows members to continue selling stocks that they know will decrease in value based on insider information they got while in Congress. Their bill would do nothing to stop Congressman Rob Bresnahan, who just last year dumped $130,000 worth of stock in 4 Medicaid providers before he voted to slash Medicaid for constituents and people across the country. It would do nothing to stop Congresswoman Lisa McClain, whose husband bought at least $100,000 worth of stock in Elon Musk's AI company shortly before its model was adopted by the Defense Department. A Common Cause report published at the end of 2025 said that members of Congress made 13,324 trades totaling a whopping $635 million in 2025. This is absurd. No wonder we are governing in a moment when public trust is at historical lows. Only 2 in 10 Americans trust the government to do what is right for them, and they are constantly seeing their elected officials selling them out to the highest bidder. They see the people elected to represent them not doing that, and instead they see those people who are elected to represent them making decisions to increase their own personal wealth and pad their profits. Who is to blame for thinking that there's no trust in Congress, in the government, when there's a president who is openly profiting from the American people? He generated at least $2.2 billion in income in his first full year in office. And now he's selling Wall Street firms early access to Truth Social posts where he brings out information that is, quote, market movers. This is literally the highway to making profit. So the Republican proposal is nothing but a sham to score cheap political points before they go home to their constituents. It tries to make you forget that there is a real solution that I helped co-lead called the Restore Trust in Government Act, which actually does ban stock trading. It does ban insider trading. It does root out corruption in government. It does prohibit presidents, vice presidents, members of Congress, and their dependent children and spouses and trustees from owning and trading individual stocks. If this Republican majority were to bring that bill to the floor, if we were allowed to force a vote on these bills, they would actually pass, and Republicans would have to admit that their bill does nothing. I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are skirting very closely to having their words taken down when they call out individual members. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues sometimes ask, who's to blame for the lack of trust for members of Congress? It is members of Congress and the press who call into question acts that are done by members of Congress that are totally legal. We already have laws in place against insider trading. There have been a couple of members of Congress who've been prosecuted for that, and that's appropriate. But the Stop Insider Trading Act will prevent that. I believe, and Republicans believe, no lawmakers should profit off of insider information. I frankly don't know how people get the insider information. But the top line about the legislation we're bringing here today is that the Stop Insider Trading Act, led by the Committee on House Administration Chairman Brian Stile, will ensure that lawmakers cannot use their positions to profit off insider information if there is insider information. The Stop Insider Trading Act has a prohibition on stock purchasing. It bans members, their spouses, and their dependent children from purchasing securities issued by a publicly traded company. It requires members to file a public notice at least 7 days, but no more than 14 days in advance for any intended stock sale with the clerk of the House of Representatives or the Secretary of the Senate. Then if a member of Congress, spouse, or dependent child decides not to sell a covered investment, the member must publicly withdraw the notice prior to its expiration. There are penalties, Mr. Speaker, for violators. They will be assessed a fine equal to $2,000 or 10% of the value of the transaction, whichever is greater, and then any net gain realized from a transaction. This is designed to make sure that members do not take advantage of any potential information or advantage that the member has. Mr. Speaker, we want to restore public trust in this institution. Members are doing their jobs diligently. They do not want to be under a cloud. News outlets and social media accounts have garnered significant attention for aggregating the stock trades of members of Congress. Under the Stock Act of 2012, lawmakers are prohibited from using non-public information for their own financial benefit. But many Americans have become concerned that the Stock Act is insufficient and stronger measures must be implemented. The Stock Insider Trading Act will increase transparency and reinforce to the American people that members are working for them, not themselves. And with that, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to respond to the gentlelady. I'm just a little confused. I thought I heard her say that, you know, we already have laws to deal with stock insider trading. So if that's the case, then why are we doing a bill to ban stock insider trading? I mean, the bottom line is we're doing it because it's a problem. And our objection is the fact that they are basically excluding somebody who is violating the law in our face right now, blatantly, who's in the White House, who's making, you know, countless millions, if not billions of dollars on some really shady deals. Quite frankly, this makes Richard Nixon look like a Boy Scout. I mean, and the deal is the American people are sick of it. They want us to clean up Washington. That includes Congress, and that includes the executive branch. And I just also would like to, you know, to kind of highlight kind of the absurdity of all the stuff that, and we have 6 different bills that we're talking about here today. But I want to read a tweet from a Republican, Tom Massey. He says, the House will pass a $12 billion bailout for farmers suffering from high fuel and fertilizer prices caused by the Iran war, expensive equipment and parts caused by tariffs, and lower sales prices for commodities due to trade disputes with China. But the GOP is fighting communism. The Republican leadership had a big press conference earlier today, and it's all about communism. But I got to say to Mr. Massey, I don't think I've heard truer words spoken by a Republican member of Congress. I really appreciate that. The truth, the accuracy of what the situation is. I now would like to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Olszewski.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this rule, and I agree. It's past time that we ban congressional insider trading. No one should benefit from public service. But wouldn't the easiest way to do that would be to just completely ban stock trading entirely, not take the baby steps attached to this bill included in the rule? Still, I was open to voting for the bill, to accept that incremental but wholly insufficient progress. But what I'm not open to, Mr. Speaker, is accepting modest progress on stock ethics, insufficient progress, in exchange for significantly compromising American voting rights. And that's also exactly what this bill would do. It would add unnecessary and unrelated provisions that make it harder for Americans to vote. Republicans can't even be bothered to provide the IDs they'd have Americans be required to have in order to vote. In fact, that was in the bill, and they took it out. That's not reform, Mr. Speaker. That's a bait and switch. It's one more ruse by this Republican majority to distract the public from their inability or their unwillingness, or both, to rein in costs and address corruption. The American people deserve so much better. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, the voter ID provisions in this bill amend the Help America Vote Act to require states to obtain a photo ID from an individual to vote in person in a federal election, or to require a copy of a photo ID to be submitted with a ballot cast other than in person. These requirements do not apply to an absent uniformed services voter or an individual provided the right to vote other than in person by the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act. The bill permits voters to use several different forms of photo ID: a valid state-issued motor vehicle driver's license that includes a photo of the individual and an expiration date, a valid state-issued identification card that includes a photo of the individual and an expiration date issued by a state motor vehicle authority, a valid United States passport for the individual, a valid photo identification card for the individual issued by the Department of Defense or the Department of Veterans Affairs, a valid identification document issued by a tribal government that includes a photo of the individual and an expiration date. And while my friends across the aisle claim the bill will prevent individuals who cannot afford a photo ID from voting, this is nothing but false alarmism. The Supreme Court has held photo ID laws are constitutional only where the state provides a photo ID to those who do not have them. In other words, the photo ID requirement in the bill is not a barrier to voting for someone who cannot afford to pay the typical photo ID fee. The data supports that Democrats are being disingenuous when they claim this bill would suppress voting. The nonpartisan National Bureau of Economic Research tracked 1.6 billion data points over an 8-year period. This massive amount of data confirms strict voter ID laws have no statistically measurable negative impact on voter participation. This comprehensive multi-year study found zero negative impact on overall registration or turnout, no drops in participation among minority or young voters, and an increase in Hispanic participation in some ID law states. Photo ID as a form of verification is a part of American life. Americans must show an ID to participate in a wide range of everyday activities, including boarding a plane, entering government buildings, cashing their checks, buying a gun, and enjoying Olive Garden's endless pasta bowl. Politico just announced more than 6,000 non-citizens were registered to vote in New Jersey and have been voting since 2023. This is clearly an issue which must be addressed. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
The gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you know, one of the frustrating things about kind of where we are in terms of political debate in this country is that issues that really matter to regular people are being ignored or being shoved aside because, quite frankly, Republicans don't want to do anything about it. They know that their agenda is unpopular. They know that people are struggling with the issue of affordability. They know that people are having a tough time paying their rent, you know, filling up their gas tanks, affording health care costs. I go on and on and on, buying food. And they don't want to talk about that. And they know that the American people kind of are sick and tired of what they're doing here. And so they're trying to divert attention. And I just want to address something that happened this morning. And that is the Republican leadership in this House held its wackadoodle press conference. I've never quite seen anything like it. Trying to divert attention away from issues of affordability and get people to look someplace else. Basically, the Republican Party's new favorite talking point is calling Democrats communists. I mean, oh my God, Mr. Speaker, I mean, really? Really? Communists? Did we accidentally step into a time machine? I get it. I get it. They don't want to talk about the real issues, the bread and butter issues. They don't want to talk about affordability. I guess my question is Joe McCarthy back from the dead? Because it sounds like that's who wrote all the garbage coming from Republicans about communism. These guys, they dust off the same tired, old talking points every time they're backed into a corner. Every time a new poll comes out saying that your economic agenda sucks, What they do is they change the subject. They try to divert attention. It is pathetic, but fine. They want to play that game. Let's play that game. Let's talk about the Republican Party, a party that worships one man above the Constitution in a cult of personality, a party that demonizes immigrants and says they poison the blood of our country, a party that calls the free press the enemy of the people and sicks the Justice Department on journalists who they don't like, a party that says their political opponents are internal enemies and calls them, quote, the enemy within, a party that is okay with invading our allies, including other democracies, a party that punishes their political opponents, that has deployed troops on our own streets, that wants to use the American military on the American people, a party that believes any unhinged lie, fantasy, and conspiracy theory as long as it comes from one man, a party that tries to lock up members of Congress for exercising their free speech rights, and a party that has tried to violently overthrow the results of a free and fair election in the United States of America, a party that, in fact, pardoned everyone who invaded this building on January 6, 2021, and tried to throw out the votes of millions of Americans because the president couldn't accept that he lost. How dare that party lecture anyone? How dare they talk about communism when their own party has totally lost touch, not just with the founding ideals of this country, but lost touch with reality itself. So if we're going to start assigning political labels based on conduct, then let's call things by their proper names. The Republican Party has become the party of fascism, full stop. They have become a party of far-right fascists who are hell-bent on destroying our country and our way of life. And every single time they call us communists, it is nothing more than a projection of their own radicalization. They don't want to talk about that, and they definitely don't want to talk about their higher grocery prices or skyrocketing gas prices or higher inflation or the cost of health care or their new endless illegal war that has now cost over $100 billion. So instead, they scream and they yell because they have nothing else left to offer. This would be funny, Mr. Speaker, if it weren't so pathetic and so unhinged. Mr. Speaker, Democrats are patriots who love this country enough to fight for it. We are fighting to make it easier for people to afford groceries. We're fighting to try to make it easier for people to afford rent, prescription drugs, and health care. And we will not be lectured by a fascist Republican Party that offers the American people nothing but lies, fear, endless culture wars, and tax breaks for billionaires. I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I think after that, we'll reserve.
Gentlewoman from North Carolina reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I will close, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to return to the question I asked at the start of this debate. Are Americans better off than they were 18 months ago? Think about the family sitting at the kitchen table tonight. The rent is due. The electric bill is higher. The grocery cart costs more. The gas tank is on empty. A prescription is waiting at the pharmacy. Somebody is trying to figure out which bill they can put off for one more week. That family does not need a lecture about how great Donald Trump is. They know what life costs, and they know it costs more, much, much more than it did 18 months ago. 18 months is long enough to judge a majority by its choices. There is a lot packed into this rule: a budget resolution, a continuing resolution, a defense bill, a disability bill, a banking bill, a bill on congressional stock trading, a bill to rig the elections, and I could go on and on and on. But Republicans could not could not find a single provision for us to consider today about lowering the cost of housing, or lowering the cost of food, or lowering the cost of medicine, or health care, or electricity. Nothing in anything we're going to be considering does any of that, focuses on any of those issues. I mean, they have time to weaken bank oversight. They have time to combine a watered-down stock trading bill with new restrictions on voting. They have time to bring back bills that failed weeks ago. They have time to protect the president, bail out powerful special interests, and finance another endless war. But helping working people somehow never makes the cut. Never makes the cut. Mr. Speaker, these bills are not just stacks of paper. They are statements on our values. They tell people who matters, who gets hurt, who gets helped, and who is expected to fend for themselves. The answer from MAGA has been painfully clear, Mr. Speaker. The greedy get protected, the well-connected get rewarded, and everyone else gets told, sorry, maybe next time. So again, I ask, are Americans better off? The answer is no. Do measures in this rule lower costs, improve their health care, make them safer, or give them a greater peace of mind? The answer is absolutely no. Nothing does that. We'll hear talks about socialism and communism and all these other stuff to get people to not focus in on how the fact that they're getting screwed over. The American people deserve more than excuses. They deserve more than distractions. They deserve more than another blank check for the people on top from this failed Republican majority. They deserve a government that is on their side. They deserve a government that is on their side. And that's not what they're getting here. And so I urge a no vote on this rule. We have to do better. We have to do better. The American people are hurting. And my friends on the other side of the aisle behave like everything is just fine. You know, nobody's noticing. Well, go out and do in-person town halls in your districts, I would say to all my colleagues who are listening, and you'll get an earful. People have had it. They're fed up with the corruption in Washington. They're fed up with policies that reward the well-off and well-connected. They're tired of getting screwed over. And with that, I yield back.